to Facebook, though none of your faces will be showing, and we will post a recording to our YouTube page for you to view later and to share with your friends if you like. So I'm going to begin with a bit of an introduction, and then Tim will provide some context and structure to our discussion, and then we'll get going with questions. So Tim Wise is among the most prominent anti-racism writers and educators in the United States. He has spent the past 25 years speaking to audiences in all 50 states on over 1,000 college and high school campuses, at hundreds of professional and academic conferences, and to community groups across the country. He is also the host of the new podcast, Speak Out with Tim Wise. He has trained corporate, government, entertainment, media, law enforcement, military, and medical industry professionals on methods for dismantling racism in their institutions. Wise has provided anti-racism training to educators and administrators nationwide and internationally in Canada and Bermuda. Wise is the author of 8 books, including his forthcoming Dispatches from the Race War. Other books include White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son, Dear White America, Letter to a New Minority, and Colorblind. Named one of 25 visionaries who are changing your world by Utna Reader, Wise has contributed chapters or essays to over 25 additional books, and his writings are taught in colleges and universities across the nation. His essays have appeared on Alternet, Salon, Huffington Post, Counterpunch, The Root, Black Commentator, BK Nation, and Z Magazine, among other popular professional and scholarly journals. Wise has been featured in several documentaries, including the 2013 Media Education Foundation release, White Like Me, Race, Racism, and White Privilege in America. The film, which he co-wrote and co-produced, has been called a phenomenal educational tool in the struggle against racism and one of the best films made on the unfinished quest for racial justice. Wise appears regularly on CNN and MSNBC to discuss race issues and was featured in a 2007 segment on 2020. He graduated from Tulane University in 1990 and received anti-racism training from the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond in New Orleans. So Tim Wise, welcome. We are so grateful to have you here today, particularly in the midst of our current environment. And so thank you for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you, even if only virtually for today. Hopefully at some point in the future, when we get on the other side of COVID, we can do this kind of thing in person and continue this conversation. I want to give everyone a bit of a disclaimer up front. It's a technological disclaimer, which I always issue because I am a 52-year-old man with virtually no technical skills whatsoever, which means that it is entirely within the realm of possibility that I might hit a button, knock my computer over, disconnect my microphone, somehow mess up my internet connection. If any of that happens, we're also having a little bit of a storm right now, so it might not always be my fault, but probably it will be. And if I lose connectivity, I have the link, I'll get back on, I'll be back with you in a few seconds. Just want to throw that out there just because I know if I don't, that'll be the time that happens. Anyway, it is great to be with you. I'm only gonna take a few minutes of your time up front to sort of frame the conversation a bit. And then I've heard that you all have gathered so many great questions that I just want to get into those. But I do want to provide a little bit of setup for the dialogue that we'll have today in the short time that we have with one another. You know, as you heard, I've been doing this work for a long time, about 30 years in some capacity, either at the grassroots level or on the road speaking and writing. And the last 25 of those have been traveling around the country. And I can say without fear of contradiction that we are currently, as I think we all can see, in the midst of a really critical moment in the history of our country. Probably one could say in the history of the world, given the nature of the global pandemic, but certainly here in the United States, we are in the midst of the largest racial justice uprising, just quantitatively, just in raw numbers, that we have ever seen in this country, dwarfing anything in the past. Millions of people in about 11,000 demonstrations, large and small, around the country just since the end of May have been pouring into the streets, to demand racial justice have been asking questions all around the country by the millions that perhaps prior to the end of May and the killing of George Floyd, they weren't asking questions about how we move toward racial justice in the realm of law enforcement, as well as in the workplace and schools. Millions of people, including millions of white Americans who, to be perfectly honest, have been given to hitting the snooze button on this particular alarm clock for many, many generations, suddenly getting out of bed and paying attention to the cries for justice that have been so normative for Black and brown folks all throughout our history, which is on the one hand incredibly heartening to see that happening. And on the other hand, one might wonder why it's happening now, why this particular moment. We can see it, but we haven't really, I think, taken the time to ask what's going on and what that means for the ability of all of us who care about justice to sustain that energy, because that's going to be what's important coming out of this summer and going into the fall and into next year, is the sustainability of this upsurge in activism. And I want to suggest that in part, what has made this moment possible, but also what makes it fraught with a certain degree of danger, is the uniqueness of the coronavirus pandemic and what that has done. What that has done is it has given us a sense of relative quiet. That is to say, we're not really living our lives in the way, most of us at least, in the way we were, let's say, prior to April, right? There's been a virtual lockdown that has kept us from going about the hustle and bustle of our daily lives. And it's allowed us to have the space, I think, physically and mentally and emotionally, to see some things that maybe many of us weren't seeing, to hear some things fully that maybe we weren't hearing, and most importantly, to feel some things that we had learned to sort of push away or to ignore. Because after all, the killing of George Floyd was not unique in many ways. We've seen this film before, so to speak. We saw Eric Garner killed on the streets of Staten Island several years ago. We saw Tamir Rice shot in the park there in Cleveland a few years back. We saw John Crawford III on film shot in the Walmart outside of Dayton and Beaver Creek several years ago. We saw Alton Sterling killed on film by law enforcement in Baton Rouge, the aftermath of Philando Castile being shot by law enforcement also in and around the Twin Cities. So we've seen this happen. And yet in the past, it did not lead to this level of an upsurge in activism. And I have to think in part, that is because of the magnitude of coronavirus, the lockdown conditions that have given us the space to see, hear, and feel. And of course, the fact that 190,000 people have died, and a disproportionate number of those have also been Black and brown folks, which is to say that COVID-19 has its own racial justice aspect in terms of the delivery of healthcare, the health consequences of racial disparity, et cetera. All of that congealing at one time to focus our attention in ways that perhaps, last year, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, it wouldn't have been. So on the one hand, fantastic. There's an opening now, even in the midst of tragedy. And we want to be there and to meet that moment. On the other hand, let's be clear, when we get on the other side of this particular moment, the larger problem of systemic racial inequity is still going to be there. And the question remains, will we be able to sustain this level of attention, this level of focus, and this level of energy when the magnitude of the COVID moment has passed, as we assume it will and certainly hope that it will? Will we be able, once we get back to the normal conditions of our daily lives, be able to remain as animated and as concerned? And I think that that's an open question, and it's one that we're going to have to confront with some level of equanimity and transparency and humility, because there's certainly no guarantee. As I said, we have hit the snooze button before, even in the 60s, a time when now we retrospectively look back and presume that everyone was in the streets and everyone was demanding justice. The fact is, most were not. And the fact is that all through the time of the civil rights movement, most white Americans, when polled, didn't think there was a problem that needed protesting, didn't actually believe that there was significant racial injustice in America. The majority in poll after poll said that Black folks were already treated equally and that protests were just going to make things worse. So that's been our history, is ignoring the problem, denying the problem, downplaying the problem, hitting the snooze button. If this moment is going to be different, we're going to have to ask why it's different, and we're going to have to commit to making it different. So I'm concerned, and I'm concerned mostly because of two reasons. Number one is the pace of the upsurge, right? When you go from 0 to 100, metaphorically speaking, in like 2.5 seconds, which is what like a drag race car, I think, can do, like in 3 or 4 seconds, it can go from 0 to 120. There's a reason that after the drag race, you don't take that car around the neighborhood for a spin, right? The reason is the engine gets blown out. When you go 0 to 100, you're probably going to overheat the engine. It's good for one race, and then you got to like rebuild it or something, right? It's like a bonfire. If you have a bonfire that burns incredibly hot, it tends to burn out much more quickly, right, than if it is more slowly stoked over time. And so my concern is that with so many people coming into the movement, which is great on one level, if we're doing it very rapidly, there's a sense of energy and urgency that isn't really always sustainable, because about 90% of the work we have to do to undo racial inequity in our workplaces, to undo racial inequity in our schools, to undo racial inequity in our healthcare delivery system, and even in our law enforcement apparatus, isn't going to take place in the streets. 90% of the work is not protest. 90% of the work is not headline grabbing stuff, right? It's the stuff we do every day. It's the way that we train teachers or don't. It's the curriculum that we use or don't. It's the way that we operate in our business and organizational capacity, the way that we recruit employees, the criteria that we use for hiring employees, the way that we evaluate employee work product and the standards that we're using and the biases that we have perhaps, at a subconscious level. All of that stuff, that's not headline grabbing stuff. Working on that is slow, and it's systemic, and it has to be sustained, and it's not always exciting, but it's the most important part. And so the pace and the energy, which is fabulous on one level, we have to be prepared for the fact that it's not always going to be at that. And sometimes I get the sense we're not prepared for that, because even now, a few months into this uprising, you'll hear some voices that seem to be very frustrated that we're not having a lot of good demonstrations and rallies every week. Like, where's the next big demonstration? And, we have to remember something. When the sit-ins hit the South, I'm in Nashville. When the sit-ins hit Nashville in February of 1960, a couple of weeks after they began in Greensboro with the 4 young men at North Carolina A&T that sat down at the Woolworths there, that was a huge moment. That new upsurge in energy in what would become that next phase of the modern civil rights movement. Well, in historical terms, here we are, this upsurge begins at the beginning of June. So here we are, July, August, September, we're about 3.5 months in. That's like saying that we're, somewhere around June, maybe the end of May, beginning of June, 1960. In historical terms. So the idea that we've got to be having huge epic demonstrations every week, that we've got to have millions of people in the streets every weekend, that's never been the way that this work happens. And we need to remember that and not get thrown off by the fact that we've tended to teach history as if it were just one big demonstration to another big demonstration to another big demonstration, and then all of a sudden you get legislative reform. That's how we've taught the civil rights movement. I mean, it is. It's the Montgomery bus boycott, then it's the sit-ins, then it's the March on Washington, then it's Selma, and then we have all these laws passed. But we forget that in between, there was a lot of stuff happening at the grassroots level, and a lot of planning and a lot of organizational work, which wasn't always sexy and exciting and headline grabbing, but it was critical. So we have to remember that. The second thing that worries me a little bit, particularly as regards the upsurge in white allyship or aspiring white allyship, is I'm not sure that those of us who are white have really explored what our motivations are for joining this struggle and being involved in this struggle. Now, that may seem like a strange question, because perhaps the motivation is obvious, right? We're concerned that racism is a functional, systemic, maybe moral and ethical evil, and we're opposed to that. That's nice. I remember many years ago when I was trained in this work, the folks that were my mentors asked me, why do I care so much about racial inequity? And I gave them some appropriately liberal answer, which I think was something along the lines of, well, an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And they looked at me very patiently and they said, yes, that one is taken. You're going to need to come up with your own. Right? Because I was simply quoting Dr. King, which we white liberals are very good at doing that. And they said, you need to come up with your own reason And I said, oh, okay. And I had to sit down and really think about why I cared so much. And it couldn't be some ephemeral, sort of rhetorical, abstract concept, why personally it mattered. And the problem is, I'm not sure we're really engaging that conversation. What I see is, I fear a lot of white folks who are getting involved out of a certain degree of shame. They feel ashamed that they didn't realize how unjust America was for Black and brown folks. They feel guilty for not knowing, right? For not realizing. Well, shame and guilt have never liberated anyone from oppression. They are of no use to marginalized people, because after all, when you feel shame or guilt about something, the only purpose that shame and guilt has is to be relieved. That's its only goal. And the best way to relieve shame and guilt is to just run away from the thing that makes you feel bad. Well, if you run away from the thing that's making you feel bad, you won't stay in the work. So we don't need that as a motivation, right? We also don't need simple righteousness, right? The idea that we're just on this burn for justice, although it's very valuable and very important, is also really difficult to sustain, because the fight for justice is a long-term battle. And if we're constantly burning at this high burn for righteous indignation reasons, it's not probably going to be sustainable. And so we have to recognize that those are not sufficient. Also, charity motivations are not sufficient. The idea that we're going to come help Black and brown people with their problem. You'll see a lot of that at some of the rallies. I've seen signs that say, I'm not sure what I'm doing, but I'm here to help, or something along those lines. And that whole mentality, though very sweet and kind, is also not going to help liberate folks who are marginalized by racism, because it presumes the problem is theirs and we're just going to sort of parachute in to help other people with their problem. What we need, I think, and what I'd love for us to talk about a little bit today in the Q&A, is why we as white folks in particular, those of us who are white, have interest convergence with those who are Black and brown. Why it is that, in fact, undoing racism is a critical imperative, not just for those who are the direct targets of it, but even for those of us who in relative terms have reaped advantages from it. Even those of us who in relative terms have been elevated by that system also pay a price. Real quick examples, and then I'll take questions so we have a sense of what I mean. As I was talking about coronavirus, it strikes me that when we think about this and we look around and we wonder why we as a country, from the administration down, were so willing to reopen everything, so hot to get back to work and open up all the restaurants and open up the bars and open up the beaches and open up the schools. And I can't help but think that part of the reason that we had such a hard time staying locked down and wanting to get reopened was because when people looked around, who they saw disproportionately dying, disproportionately being affected, were those other people. Right? The very fact that it was disproportionately Black and brown, disproportionately working class, disproportionately older, and disproportionately people with pre-existing conditions all allowed others within our society to say, well, yeah, I mean, people are going to die, but, they're already sick and they're sort of old. Right. And then, of course, this sort of eugenic mentality of which life is more valuable and which life is less valuable kicks in. And we've had that mentality for hundreds of years. It was created to justify white supremacy, right? It was created to justify enslavement. It was created to justify the extirpation of indigenous peoples. But the irony is, when you create a mentality of human hierarchy that says some lives are more valuable than others, you can't be surprised when eventually it seeps out of that container that you tried to keep it in. So perhaps it was created for the purpose of white domination, right? But at the end of the day, we have millions of white folks now who are also dying, or hundreds of thousands and millions of families affected by COVID-19 as a result of a mentality that sort of said, well, if you're over 70 years old, well, you've had a nice life, good luck, right? Or, oh, you have diabetes, well, maybe you should stay in, but the rest of us have got to get back to normal. It was essentially now a mentality that says that everyone's life is expendable if they're older, if they're sicker, if they're poorer, not just if they're Black or brown. So in a way, lots of white folks have interest convergence right now with those Black and brown folks pushing for a better healthcare system, pushing for greater equity in healthcare delivery. Or you think about the opioid crisis. Why do we have such a problem with the opioid crisis, right? And hundreds of thousands of white folks, millions, in fact, have been affected disproportionately in small towns and rural communities. Why? Because years ago, those very same folks And a lot of other white folks in the electorate decided to vote for candidates who promised to deal with drug addiction like a crime problem, not a health problem. And so we decided we're not going to fund rehabilitation. We're not going to fund treatment. We're not going to fund drug education. We're only going to fund the construction of prisons. Why? Because those people over there will be the ones who get locked up. And then you wait 20 years, 25 years, and what do you know? All of a sudden, the rehabilitation and the treatment programs that we need and that our families need aren't there either, because at some point years ago, we decided we didn't need them because it was just the folks on the other side of town who were being affected. So there too, interest convergence, white folks needing the same type of society that Black and brown folks have always needed, and the problems coming back to bite us on the rear end that perhaps we didn't think would. Or the very fact that we have such disparate healthcare. Now, there have been some studies from the Kennedy School of Government a few years back, studied this, and they discovered that one of the primary reasons we don't have universal healthcare in this country, affordable healthcare for everyone, or view healthcare and other safety net programs as real entitlements, the reason folks are so quick to want to cut those programs is because the number one most highly correlated factor is the belief that Black people will abuse the programs if we expand them, that they will take advantage of the programs. What's the irony? The irony is, if we don't create those programs, they're not the only ones who don't have them. We also need them, and we also don't have them. So once again, creating greater equity, creating a mentality that doesn't divide us into the lives that are more valuable and the lives that are less valuable is critical for everyone. This is why Black Lives Matter is so important, because until Black Lives Matter, all lives can't, because we create a society that undermines the basis of community. And so I think if we begin to talk about this moment in that way, not trying to save the other, not trying to be charitable to the other, not trying to feel bad about what's been done to the other, but recognizing that we've created a society that has targeted the other and in effect created collateral damage in our own communities, in our own families that affect all of us, that's the way we're going to stay in the work. Because once we realize that our lives are at stake as well, not just someone else's, then we don't have the luxury of deciding next month, next year, 2 years from now, whenever we get on the other side of COVID, we won't have the luxury of saying, oh, well, that was a nice moment. Now I need to go on and work on this issue. Then we'll be able to actually see this is our issue. And it's something that we have to work on as if our lives depend upon it, because they do. So I want to leave it with that. I'll take the questions that you all have gathered. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. It's a wonderful honor, and let's have the Q&A. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Tim. And actually, those remarks probably are a great segue into our first question. As we were preparing for this forum and announcing your visit, multiple people reached out to ask why we were having a white person speak to us about race. Couldn't we have invited a Black person, people asked. So I just want to start for a moment with some background for how we got here. Yeah. Since George Floyd was murdered in May, the clergy and I have been engaging in conversation with some of our non-white parishioners. And one suggestion that we received was that we invite speakers of multiple ethnicities to speak about race. We don't want to only hire Black people to speak on issues of diversity, thereby implying that racism is a problem for Black people to solve. So I know you've written about this dilemma before, since you're a white man who has dedicated his life to anti-racism education. And so can you speak to the importance of white people teaching about anti-racism?
Sure. Well, first, let me just speak to the question, because it's a great question. And you absolutely should, of course, invite and have and hire and bring in Black folks to talk about this issue as often as you can, because clearly that is, the Black folks were my primary mentors and teachers on this issue, going back to the time that I was a child, even long before sort of college and the professional mentorship after that. So absolutely, from the perspective of expertise, Black and brown folk, particularly Black folk, have to be center in that conversation. Having said that, I think it is a mistake that we sometimes make, and I think the way you set that up speaks to it. If all we do is listen to the voices of Black and brown folks talking about racism and white supremacy, even though we're trying to do that for the sake of centering their voices, the inadvertent effect, I think entirely unintended, is to reproduce the mentality that this is their problem, and at best, we're going to help them with it. right? That we're going to somehow connect to it. And the importance of white folks seeing this as our issue is what is going to actually keep us in the work. And that's actually going to work to the benefit of Black and brown centering, because the more people in the work, the more that those voices will actually get heard. And so there's a reciprocal sort of arrangement. I think for those of us who are white, we have to be very clear that it isn't just a practical thing. Yes, on a practical level, we know that speaking to our own family, speaking to our own work colleagues, speaking to our own parishioners in a church, if it's an overwhelmingly white institutional space, speaking to people in our own sort of white lives is always easier done when you're connected to them. So there is obviously a practical benefit and efficacy to having white folks speaking about this issue, because we can reach some folks that maybe Black and brown folks can't. And that's something the Black Power movement told white folks 50 years ago. I mean, at the time, the late 60s, Black folks in both the Black Panthers and in SNCC and others were telling white activists, listen, you have a very important role to play. It is talking to your people, because we can't always talk to your people because they won't always listen to us. Maybe they'll listen to you. So white folks have a role, particularly in white spaces. I don't think that we should be taking up a lot of space, however, in those really mixed spaces. Like, I don't think we need to be going to the Black Lives Matter strategy session and raising our hand with all of our recommendations. Like, that's the time I think we take that back seat. But there are times when we have to step up as well. And I think those are in our mostly white spaces, which frankly are the spaces that we're usually in. I mean, the research finds that about 85% of white Americans live in communities where there are virtually no Black and brown folks around. And I realize that in Cleveland Heights and Shaker Heights, in the area where you all are, it's a little bit more diverse than that in terms of the geographic representation of the broader sort of area, but we still tend to live in pretty white worlds. Even if we live in integrated communities, we still have our little enclaves. They may be work enclaves, they may be church enclaves, they may be school enclaves, they may be social circles. And so as a result, we got a lot of white on white time. And when we're in that white on white time, we need to be stepping up. It's not enough to just say, here, read this book by a Black person. Or here, go watch this video by someone who's Latinx, or, go read their stuff. Like, that's good. And we should do that. But, a curated Google search is not what people need. What they need is for us to also speak from our heart about why this matters to us, because any white person I've ever known who really cared and had a heart for this issue had a story as to why. It's not because you took a critical theory class. It's not because you had a really good sociology professor. It's not because someone told you to read Ibram Kendi, although you should read Ibram Kendi. It's not that. It's because something happened in your life to open you up to hearing this. It's certainly true for me. And it's true for most everyone I know. And so getting in touch with that and leading with that and sharing that is the way that we're going to connect to other white folks and bring them into this struggle as real allies and co-conspirators, not just as sort of, passive observers.
Right. Great. Thank you. So one parishioner actually submitted a related question. We are wondering if you, as you engage with these topics, have accountability partners who are people of color. So if so, how did you choose them? And as it applies to us, where our faith community is majority white, how do individuals and congregations find racial equity partners?
Yeah, I mean, it can be a struggle for folks in certain settings. I was very, very fortunate as I was coming up in this work. I started out working in New Orleans. And so my very first forays into anti-racism work were in a community where most of the anti-racist leadership was Black folks. And the people at the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, who were my first mentors, they were early on accountability partners. The organization I actually worked for was directly accountable to them. You actually had to go through training to work for that organization. They were the members of the board. They were the ones who did the hiring, the firing, the promotion, the work evaluation, everything. Once I got out of New Orleans and was on the road traveling, I had to then sort of craft accountability folks around the country with whom I was meeting. And but the good news was, right, I was in a space to do that. I was meeting folks everywhere who were quick to want to be that. I mean, they wanted to check me and they wanted to follow up with me. And so I would submit writing to them before I would publish it, or, I would run ideas by them about speeches and what I was going to talk about and what I should talk about, and take, feedback constantly. So I had this almost organic way of having those connections that maybe not everyone has. I think the way that one has to do it, though, it's a slow process. You can't just approach Black and brown folks and, say literally or metaphorically, will you hold me accountable? Because if I were Black and brown and you came to me and said that, I'd be like, who are you exactly? Like, why would I do that? But if you already have people in your life who are Black and brown, having that conversation can, I think, emerge and develop over time in a pretty organic way. And then also, I think if you're in, we were doing the tech setup before everyone else got on the call. I happened to mention that several years ago, the diocese, one of the Episcopal dioceses in Missouri, brought me in, and it was a very white parish, very white bunch, and they really wanted, right, they were sort of on the approach of wanting greater diversity within their churches. And I said, well, that's fine. And if you can get that, great. But the more important issue, right, is for you to be working with Black folks, let's say, on issues of joint concern. Now, those might be Black Episcopalians. They might not be. They probably, in most cases, won't be, but they're out there in church community groups, in nonprofit groups, civic organizations. Why don't you connect with them and start talking about, could be police brutality issues, education reform, housing equity. And over time, as you begin to develop relationships with folks, then that becomes an organic way to hold you accountable, right? Because now you're actually forging those connections. It's hard to do it if you don't have them. But one way is to say, look, rather than focus on diversity for diversity's sake, which is fine, let's get together and say, what are some things that we can work on together with folks who have their own institutional space and who like their own institutional space, but might also want partners to work on some things. And as you develop those relationships, those connections and accountability structures will develop. They won't always be perfect. They never are perfect, because it's hard to be held accountable in a perfect way. And it's hard for someone to hold you accountable in a perfect way. But the only way it ever happens is when those relationships are forged. And so if you don't have them now, try to create them at an institutional level. And then the individuals within that institution will get to know one another better. And those things will, I think, start to blossom.
Right. My guess is we have a group here called Greater Cleveland Congregations. And I'm guessing some of our members are like raising their hand and wanting to talk, because that's exactly what we have there, which is great. It's a group of about 40 congregations, Black and white, that come together for issues in the area and have been effective in change. So good. All right. So you tell many stories in your book, White Like Me, which I just had the chance to read, which I'm grateful. You talk about how deeply ingrained racism is in our bodies. And when you were growing up, your mom was always clear and consistent about the sin of racism. Yet in her Fear and Sadness, when you were leaving for college, the two of you got into a very heated argument where she was spewing some racist comments. You talked about your grandmother, Mabel, who insisted her children, have a deep and abiding contempt for racism. And yet with her paranoia and anger that comes with Alzheimer's, she began to refer to the Black help with the N-word. And you even told a story, very vulnerable. You told a story about yourself, someone who has dedicated their whole life to doing this kind of work. And you got in an airplane one day and there were two Black pilots, and you had this moment of wondering, is the plane going to get there? And of course, you realized almost right away what you had done, but still you did it. Yeah. And so can you help us, can you help white people understand how we resist recognizing this in ourselves and the importance of being able to recognize it? Well,
we resist recognizing it in ourselves in part for a good reason, a salutary reason, a reason that we want to acknowledge and hold up, which is that we want to be good people. The good news is most of us are caring, compassionate people. Most people, I think, are. I tend to think most folks are pretty good folks. But the problem is when you're a good person, and especially when you're very invested in seeing yourself as a good person, which many of us are, perhaps because of the jobs that we do and the way that we move in the world, you are sometimes especially unwilling to look at the uglier parts, right? And this isn't just around race. This is around anything. This is around the way that we parent. This is around our relationships with our partners and spouses, right? This is around the way that we treat friends. I mean, we never want to reflect on the ugly parts of ourselves. We love to reflect on the pretty parts and the good parts. And I've had to go to therapy to get clear on this. And by the way, my therapist told me I should, tell you that I'm in therapy because it's therapeutic, apparently. So there you have it. But in any event, like, the reason we do that is to excavate the trauma, right? And to excavate the trauma of our childhoods or whatever has brought us to the place where we're bringing out trauma into the world in the way that we react with others or the way we treat others or ourselves. And there's been a lot of racialized trauma on this land. Most of it, of course, directed directly at Black and brown bodies. But the thing is, when you direct oppression at Black and brown bodies, and the history of this country is about that, there's got to be a residual. In other words, you think about the thing that is required for this system to last for 400 years on this piece of land that we now call the United States is not just the deliberate cruelty of some, but it's the empathic collapse of others, right? It's the collapse of empathy in other people, the inability or the unwillingness of people to speak to what they know is happening. It's why you can go back and read narratives and diaries and journals kept by people that were enslavers, or like the wives of the husbands that owned other human beings, and they had opioid problems, drinking themselves to death because they were trying to numb the horror of what they knew they were themselves involved in. There was a need to do that. And I would suggest to you that once you allow empathic collapse to happen, you turn it on others, you turn it on your own loved ones, you'll turn it on yourself. And so I think there's a really clear reason why we don't want to talk about what this does to us and the conditioning that it does. But the important thing about reflecting on it, the important thing about acknowledging our conditioning, is that only by acknowledging that trauma and what it's done to us, not just what it's done to others, but what it has done to us, how it has changed us, how it changed my grandmother and took her from the individual that she was, who was deliberately anti-racist and clearly so, to someone who could spout the N-word at the nurses that were taking care of her in her final days in the throes of Alzheimer's, when she no longer had the power to resist. That didn't make her an evil person. It made her a complicated person. Or the fact that my grandfather, her husband, who had died several years before, gave money, funded the civil rights movement, grew up in the Black community, because as a Jew, the only place he was allowed to live really in Nashville at the time was sort of on Jefferson Street in the heart of the Black community. And so he was a huge supporter of the struggle, clearly connected personally to Black folks, and he was a business person that owned a liquor store in the Black community. So he was essentially a drug dealer in the hood. Like, legitimately, that's what he was. And we don't view him that way because we're told not to. Well, he was a businessman, and yeah, he had a liquor store, but how is that any different than someone who's Black who lives in the same community and slings weed? Like, there's no difference other than the legality of it. But one we look at as an entrepreneur and a business person, the other we look at as a criminal. My grandfather was complicated. Doesn't mean he was evil. It means he was complicated. And being clear on that allows us to then make a choice to choose resistance, and not just resistance for the sake of others, but for the sake of ourselves, right? To redeem ourselves, to be more whole ourselves. And so that radical humility that says that we're all damaged by this thing is the first step. If we're going to really stay in this work, which is going back to what, when they asked me, the People's Institute folks said, why do you do this work? And I gave them that nice Dr. King approved, line. And I went back and they said, that's not enough. Why do you care? And I sat down and I took inventory. That was when I had like 10 pages of things in my life where I had seen racism play out, where I had benefited from privilege, where I had remained silent in the face of racism, or times when I had resisted. And even those moments, that was very important to recognize too, because all of those said, this is in your body. This is in your life. This is your script. It's not just someone else's script. And once I realized that, this became the self-help that we like to preach to other people, right? It became that for me. And I think that's what it has to be if we're going to stay in the work.
Right. It's sort of, it's scary to go there. It's painful to recognize it, but it's the beginning of moving forward. Yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, particularly for people who have children or grandchildren in their lives. So you talk in your book about the importance of discussing inequity with our children. White parents with white children might shy away from this discussion, but if we avoid the discussion, our children may develop an internal narrative, right, with prejudicial or even racist conclusions. So for those of you those who haven't had a chance to read your book, can you talk a little bit about the need to have the discussion?
Sure. Well, when we know from the research, a couple things are true. One is that about 2/3 of white parents say, 2/3 to 3/4 say that they never or rarely ever discuss issues of race or racism with their kids. Now, that polling and survey was before the current uprising. Maybe that is changing a little bit, but I would venture to guess that still the majority are not really having those conversations. Whereas the vast majority of Black parents, for instance, do indeed talk about this with their kids, and at a pretty early age, because a second piece of research is also true, which says that Black kids are aware of the stereotypes held about their group by the time they're no older than 8, often by the time they're 5. So Black parents realize most often that they have to have this conversation, right? Just as a defense mechanism against what their kids are dealing with every day. Whereas white parents feel, understandably, that maybe we don't have to. The problem is when we don't, our kids are also being exposed to the stereotypes about Black folks, about Latinx folks, about whomever, right? And they're being exposed implicitly to assumptions about themselves, right? So if think about it. I mean, if you're a white kid and you grow up in a society where you were told wherever you end up is all about your own effort and anybody can make it in America, which is, after all, the secular gospel. Like, if America were a Bible, that's Genesis 1:1, right? That's the very first thing in the book. And if you're told that, and then you look around and you see such incredible disparity, with white disproportionately on top and Black and brown beneath, or men disproportionately on top, women beneath, or rich on top, poor beneath, then racism, sexism, and classism start to make sense, right? These become default positions, judging the poor for their poverty, judging women for earning 70 cents on the dollar, whatever the number's at right now, blaming Black and brown folks for disproportionate poverty or incarceration or educational failure, whatever it is. And so unless we're having a conversation where we're encouraging a critical analysis of that, most kids are going to default to that, because they're going to hear the propaganda and they're going to look around and they're going to see it. I remember driving with my kids. My girls are dancers, and now they're 19 and 17. One just started college, actually, at Ohio State, keeping our fingers crossed that she'll be able to stick around for a while. The dancers are dancing outside, whatever they got to do, in order to stay in school. But she's 19. The other one is 17. When they were like 12 and 10, we were driving from their school to the dance studio, where they were in a dance company in downtown Nashville. And in between the school and the studio downtown is a public housing community. We're driving through it. We're stopped at a red light. We've stopped at that red light many times, but on this particular day, the 10-year-old looked around, took note of the community, and asked a very simple 10-year-old question, which is, "Daddy, why is this neighborhood pretty much all Black?" Excellent question. Right? This is like urban anthropology in the back of my Highlander. This is like high level, graduate level sociology, and she's 10. I was relatively impressed with her observational skills. I proceeded to give them the 3-minute version because I didn't have a lot of time, 3 minutes left to get to the studio, and their kids. I can't give them the PhD level version. I don't have a PhD, but even if I did, I can't give them that version. So I gave them a very quick, brief discussion about how communities came to look the way that they look, and how it wasn't accidental. Public housing, initially created for poor white people. But at the same time, the government then creates the FHA loan program, the VA loan program, later on the GI Bill, theoretically open to all veterans or returning GIs, but in practice, most of those things disproportionately benefited white families, the FHA program almost exclusively so for 30 years. And so the same white people who had been given subsidized housing by the government in the 30s, in the 40s and 50s, start hustling it out to the suburbs. Who's left behind? The folks who couldn't get those loans. That's how these communities came to look the way they look. If I don't give my kids that history, however brief and age appropriate I was able to give it to them at the time, if I don't tell them that, my kid is still going to wonder. Like, if she never asks that question, does that mean she wasn't noticing? No, she was noticing. It just so happens on that day she asked. If she asks and I decide I shouldn't answer because, oh boy, I don't want to get into that, my kid's going to reach her own conclusions. And the only conclusions that she's going to reach are the ones that this culture taught her. And the ones that the culture are giving her are, well, they're over there living like that because, you know, they just didn't work as hard. Because if they did, they'd be over there living differently. Like, that's the default. And so we have to have this conversation. And instead, what we usually do is we hush the conversation. You know, I ask questions sometimes in workshops where I ask white folks, when did you first, what was one of your first lessons about race, or the first time that you encountered the other? What happened, you know, in that encounter? And folks have stories about being 5 years old in the grocery store, in the park, seeing somebody who's Black for the first time, or noticing somebody who's Black or whatever for the first time, and saying something to their parent, right? Because of course you notice difference, you like pull on the pants leg or whatever. And almost every time the parent's response was, shh, right? And of course the parent thinks they're just telling the kid, don't be rude. It's rude to point, right? But what the kid hears, the kid's 5 or whatever, the kid doesn't understand the kid hears danger, because shh is what you would say as a parent if you were in the woods with your child and a bear came upon you. That's what you would do. You would say shh, as in that's dangerous. So that's what the kid hears. We start that very, very early, and it warps, I think, our children's sense of the society in which they live. So it's not easy. There's a great book, though, that my friend Jennifer Harvey wrote. I did the foreword to it, but my foreword is not the important part. The book is the important part, called Raising White Kids. And it's a fantastic book that talks about how parents can really engage this conversation at a higher level with their children. So I'd highly recommend that.
Yeah. You're just making me think about my own upbringing. There were no Black families when I was growing up in, grade school, middle school. It wasn't until I hit high school there was one Black family.
Yeah.
And I grew up in a affluent, highly educated area. And so what does your mind, if you're not talking about it, where does it go? Right. Well, This is where the white people are. So where are the Black people?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Hopefully we can squeeze in another. We've got so many good questions. So, and this one is a little complicated. It's on the topic of self-awareness. Our congregation, as you know, is situated among several wealthy suburbs of Cleveland. And there's a novel out, Little Fires Everywhere, which is set in Shaker Heights here. And one of the topics of the novel wrestled with is how communities and people of privilege often get stuck in the trap of perfectionism. And you speak openly and vulnerably in your memoir about the power of perfectionism and the impulse to think that we are immune to racism. So I was especially interested in how you brought this up in the discussion of your father's alcoholism. And you wrote, to be an American and to be white is to be told in a million different ways that the world is your oyster. It is to believe, because so many outward signs suggest it, that you can do anything and be anything your heart desires. And so one's expectations are so high. Yeah. And yet one's achievement can fall short. And then what happens? So can you speak to us a little bit? I know this is complicated, but sort of the intersection of perfectionism and privilege and anti-racism work?
Sure. Well, it's not even just perfectionism, but it's definitely success. And, when I brought up the opioid crisis earlier, we could extend that analysis and say, look, there's a reason why between 1999 and 2013, there were 500,000 excess deaths among white, working class, non-college educated people in this country. 500,000 people who died who wouldn't have died if the death rates had continued in the direction they were headed prior to 99. What were those deaths caused by? Opioids and other drug addictions, by heavy drinking and cirrhosis of the liver, and directly as a result of suicide were disproportionately what caused them. Why? Why is it that these folks, even though they're struggling, these are working class, non-college educated white folks, even though they're struggling on any objective scale, Black and brown folks were still struggling more, still had higher poverty, still had, worse outcomes in every system imaginable. And yet the suicide rates higher with white folks, the drug overdose rates higher with white folks, the heavy drinking higher with white folks. These have been called deaths of despair, but that's not really enough, right? It's deaths of despair relative to expectation. I would suggest that to be Black or brown is to have always known at some point, at some level, that the mythology of America was just that. It's to know that the promise isn't real in a lot of ways. But to be white, even if you're working class, you're sort of told if you double down, if you work really hard, it'll be better for your kids. And now we're living in a global economy where that isn't guaranteed, right? We're living in a society where small towns are dying, where the plants are leaving and they're not coming back. And we've got folks that don't know how to cope with the stuff that Black and brown folks always were coping with, which was uncertainty. And in fact, if anything, the expectation that things could go sideways any day. But to be white, you didn't have to feel that way. So it isn't even just the search for perfection. It's the fact that America has made a promise to white people, and especially white men, that in fact, it never really intended to keep for working class people. And if you were Black and brown, you knew it. It's like Black and brown folks are in the hull of the Titanic, metaphorically speaking, and they're shouting up to the people in the middle and in the promenade deck, like, hey, the ship is gonna go down, y'all. And the other white folks are like, what are you talking about? We got orchestra music. Well, we're good. What do you mean? And they're like, no, for real. Like the boat is going to sink. And you have the luxury of ignoring it until it's too late. And then when you realize, it is too late. So I feel like in part, what we've done is we've set ourselves up. Inequality, right, sets up the people who normally win. Maybe some win more than others, but the folks who normally are on top of things get set up with expectations. And, back in the 60s, during the uprisings of 65, 67, and 68, there were a lot of sociologists who were asking the question, hey, why are we having these riots or rebellions in 67 as opposed to 57? Because you could make the argument, 57 was objectively worse. It's before the civil rights reforms. It's before the Great Society. Why are we having the rebellions after those things? And the sociological explanation was, well, rising expectations. Once you start making promises to people that stuff's going to get better and then you don't fulfill it, that's when the anger emerges. That's when the rage emerges. Okay, if that's true, and history says it is, if rising expectations for people who never had expectations can cause them to get angry when those expectations are unfulfilled, what do you think happens to people that you always promise the moon to when they find out that they can't have the moon, right? That's the dysfunction of inequality, even for white people. And for my father, I've always thought that his addictions, his rage issues, his emotional abuse was in part, not entirely, but in part the result of being a white man who wasn't successful as he thought he should have been. And also he was a Jewish guy. He was a comic and a stand-up comic and an actor. Not to reinforce stereotypes, but like there are a lot of Jews in the world of comedy in the 1960s. And if you weren't making it as a Jew in comedy, you really felt like a total schlub and a total failure, right? And so I'm sure that the combination of whiteness, masculinity, and being a Jewish person in that industry and not succeeding probably ate away at him in ways that he had to numb. Very destructive. He would have been healthier. My family would have been healthier. Our country would be healthier with less inequality, because less inequality prevents you from having these unrealistic expectations. The expectations now become lateral and they become communal as opposed to individual, where it's not just about me being above you, right? It's about all of us rising together.
Right. Right. All right. This hour has gone much too fast. I want to say that I am grateful to you for the hopeful note on which you conclude your book, White Like Me. You talk about the letter that Archbishop Desmond Tutu wrote you when you were involved with the divestment battle at Tulane. And he wrote, "You do not do the things you do because others will necessarily join you in the doing of them, not because they will ultimately prove successful. You do the things you do because the things you are doing are right." And I find these words inspirational, sort of as MLK said, to keep on keeping on. When we are discouraged that we aren't making enough progress against the sin of racism, And I thank you for pointing us to the journey that in striving for equality and freedom, we become human, and encouraging us to be unafraid to live for what is right. So I'm grateful to you, and I don't know, any final words you might offer us?
I would just add to what you just said. You know, when I always close my books with something along those lines, and I think some people, it gets tedious for them because they're like, oh, I read that ending in your last book, but it's worth repeating, because I think, you know, we live in a culture that's very much about the outcome. It's very much about, well, if we have a problem, let's solve it. And it's a very, I think, frankly, very white Western way of looking at issues. That's sort of like, well, I have a headache, I'll take a pill. You know, I have this issue, I have a quick fix. And there are no quick fixes to a problem that's been coming for this long. This is the kind of stuff that has been going on for a very long time. The odds that any of us are going to be the ones to see racial injustice, you know, eradicated, very unlikely. But we have to be part of this great train of history of trying to do better in every generation. James Baldwin talked about it as earning our death. And I know that sounds like a very macabre concept, but when you earn your death by the way that you choose to live, right? You earn the right to leave this place by the way that you behave while you're in this place, and you redeem your life and all the resources that you took up. Like, there are lots of other beings on this planet, not just human, that could probably have made better use of the resources that I take up every day. So in order to justify the resources that I take up, I need to do something to meet that moment and meet the miracle of my own life, and all of us, the miracle of all of our lives. And I can think of a lot worse ways to spend 70, 80, 90, if we're lucky, 100 years than to try to make this world a better place. So
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm, as I said, grateful for the words of inspiration for our journeys. And I do hope that when COVID is over, we might meet again. So
I hope so too. Thank you so much.
thank you, Tim. Have a great day. And thank you all for participating today. I'm so grateful, and I look forward to follow-up conversations with all of you.
Thank you.
Take care.